Next slide. That brings us to today's talk. We have a team from the Niagara Parks Commission. So Travis Hill has been part of the Niagara Parks team for almost 20 years and is the manager of Niagara Parks' Old Fort Erie Heritage Site. He's widely respected for his cultural knowledge and has been asked to provide Indigenous interpretation, programming, and speaker sessions at various historic sites in Ontario and the United States. He's a citizen of the Tuscarora Nation, a member of the Beaver Clan of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and calls the town of Fort Erie home. Jim Hill has been with the Niagara Parks Commission Historic Sites for 25 years. He's currently the Senior Manager of Heritage. His portfolio includes Old Fort Erie, the Laura Secord Homestead, the Mackenzie Printery, and McFarland House. There is also an extensive art and artifact collection, plus over 100 markers, monuments, and plaques along the Niagara Parkway. So join me in welcoming Jim and Travis, and I believe, Jim, you're going to speak first.
Yeah, I'm going to go first as the non-Indigenous Hill. We want to acknowledge that the site of the Battle of Chippawa and all the lands that Niagara Parks cares for, not only were the scene of battles 200 years ago, but that's a short blip in human history. People have been along the river for 13,000 years. And they are still very much here. And for myself, personally, it's been an honor to work with and learn from our Indigenous partners over the years. And in our region of the world, we acknowledge the Attawaddaron. Usually the French refer to them as the neutrals, the Anishinaabe, in particular the Mississauga Nation of the Anishinaabe, and the Haudenosaunee, or the Six Nations in English, particularly the Seneca of the Haudenosaunee, who also lived along the Niagara River. And of course, the name places we're talking about: Niagara in Ontario, in Canada, all Indigenous names. We've kind of screwed up the interpretation or pronunciation of places. That even includes Chippewa. Now, that's considered a nation of the Anishinaabe, but in many ways, I'll blame the French, a mispronunciation of Ojibwe. So even the thing we're talking about today, we haven't been very thoughtful in how we've named things. Almost got the names of places right, and hopefully we'll do better over time. I also want to talk about Tom and Chris and hopefully some of the people I'm sure who are joining us today who volunteered their time to bring history alive at places like Old Fort Erie, the Battle of Chippawa, the Battle of Queenston Heights. We'll be commemorating that October 15th this year, the 210th anniversary of that particular battle. And the reenacting community we get to work with, these are folks who drill down to a level that's really impressive about the lives of individuals that maybe get lost in the larger history of presidents and kings and generals, and they've really drilled down to the lives of individual men and women. And I've certainly learned a lot from people in the hobby. And I'm sure some of you maybe are within arm's reach on your bookshelf of a copy of Donald Graves' book, Red Coats and Gray Jackets, acknowledged, I think, as the book on the Battle of Chippawa. So today I'm going to talk a bit about the battle, and then I'm going to throw questions to Travis about the Indigenous experience at this battle and around the events that take place. It's a pretty significant event in the history of Indigenous people in our region. So if you want to go to the next slide, Travis. This will hopefully, if you can see it on your screen, give you a sense of geography. We kind of forget that. I think Travis and I did a talk, right, Travis? And we forgot there were people from outside of our part of North America who maybe didn't know a lot about the War of 1812. So this is our backyard. This is the Niagara River going from Lake Erie to Lake Ontario. Everything on the right is New York State. Everything on the left is the province of Ontario today, or what was called Upper Canada 200 years ago. And had been already the scene of quite a bit of fighting in the first 2 years of the war. So Queenston Heights is the major engagement in the fall of 1812. It heats up in 1813 as the Americans get better at their trade at places like Fort George, beaver dams. Just off the map, of course, is Stoney Creek, a little further west in what is now the city of Hamilton. And some other engagements, the Battle of Frenchman's Creek, at the bottom of the map there. A lot of people haven't heard of it. Actually, more British soldiers died at the Battle of Frenchman's Creek than at Queenston Heights, but none of them were named Isaac Brock, the commander of the Crown Forces in Upper Canada and the administrator of the province at the time. So an important engagement early in the war. But in 1814, a very well-trained, disciplined American army, and when we say army, it's a force of maybe in total 4,500 men. They cross and land above and below Fort Erie. That may sound like they had submarines or paratroopers, but of course, everything around here, like the name Upper Canada, is about how high above sea level you are, or upriver or downriver. So they had a force go almost on the lake side of the town of Fort Erie, and then cross directly in the Niagara River. An important young general named Winfield Scott wanted to be the first guy ashore. He was 28 years old, recently promoted to brigadier general, 6'4", strapping guy in his 20s. And he'd already been to Canada before, had a horrible experience. The problem is when he stepped off the boat to be the first American to land in July of 1814, he steps into 7 feet of water. And there was apparently much laughter amongst the guys on the boats. And then he emerged from the water, and they all shut up very quickly because he was known as a rather harsh disciplinarian. So they quickly capture Fort Erie. There's only 137 British soldiers in the fort. So it surrenders with a few shots being fired. The Americans actually suffer 1 or 2 casualties, not including young General Scott falling in the Niagara River. And then they quickly start heading north, but they can't go too quick because they're running into a British fellow named Pearson, who has a mixed force of British and Canadian and Indigenous troops with him. And that little blue squiggly line going along the Niagara River, there's little creeks all along the way, and he's wrecking the bridges and taking pot shots at them as they head north. But they move along, and by the end of the day on July the 4th, they've set up camp just outside of the village of Chippawa, along the Chippawa Creek. And if you want to go to the next slide, Travis, you can see the big blue area there is the American camp. And the first action really starts in the morning of July 5th, 1814, when skirmishers in the form of native warriors and some local Canadian militia make their way to the other creek that's involved here, Streets Creek, not as impressive as the Chippawa Creek, but a bit of an obstacle, and has a bridge that you can see there over it. So they start firing on the American camp, and the American overall commander is not Winfield Scott. It's a guy named Jacob Brown, not a military man, but he'd done very well the previous year as a militia officer and was promoted to Major General at the same time as a more famous guy named Andrew Jackson, and another guy named Izzard, lesser known. Brown, not being a military man, probably does well because he adapts quicker, and it does a good job at Sackett's Harbor the previous year. So he's given overall command, and he sends men across the creek to clear away these people who were sniping at him. General Ryle, the British commander, assumes that Fort Erie has not surrendered and that hopefully he can move his force out and pin the Americans or even get in a quick victory against their advanced forces. If you can go to the next slide, Travis. And as he's making his way along, General Brown is at Usher's farm. He sees the dust kicked up by British boots heading along the river road. Also, the rate of fire changes in the woods on the flank of the plain when some British light infantry join in, reinforcing their Canadian and Indigenous friends. The Americans quickly cross the bridge. When I say Americans, it's really just their 1st Brigade, commanded by young Scott. There's a 2nd Brigade commanded by a fellow named Ripley, and then there's a militia brigade that also includes a large contingent of a couple hundred Haudenosaunee or Six Nations warriors, and even a contingent of Canadians who don't actually fight in this battle, but who have volunteered full-time to work with the Americans. So what you're seeing there is the deployment of Scott's Brigade along this farmer's lane. And once they push across the bridge, they move along the laneway at Usher's Farm, and then they advance about 50 paces north. And then his General Riles' brigade is coming south. He's got some veteran officers and troops. The 8th, who you'll see sort of in the rear there, both of their battalions have been in Canada for a while. This is sort of an amalgamated group of the 8th. The 1st Battalion of the 1st Foot, the Royal Scots, and then the 100th Regiment is there as well, commanded by a Marquess of all things, a guy named George Hay, who's seen extensive action already in Portugal and in Spain, fighting Napoleon's army. On the American side, you can see that these are the numbers of the American units: the 25th U.S. Infantry, the 11th, the 21st, and a combination of the 9th and the 22nd. Again, there's veterans now. These guys have had 2 years of experience. They've got young commanders. And the goal here is, if not take over all of Upper Canada, it's to teach the British a bit of a lesson. Next slide, Mr. Hill. I think the battle's going faster than it should have.
Oh, geez. One sec.
So as the British are advancing, they don't get their whole line deployed. And the only artillery on the field are very evenly matched, these two teams. There's about 1,500 men on each side. The Americans have one more artillery gun than the British, but the British have two massive 24-pounder field guns, which seems, for people who know artillery back then, seems incredibly huge. But they mount these big guns on carriages and deploy them on the river road. So there's guns on the road, taking pot shots at each other. So we're covering everything here. It's good. There we are. So there's really now two battles going on, and one on the plain. This happens a lot in the War of 1812, and then in the tree line in the woods, there's sort of a second battle going on at a different pace and different tactics. You've got British light infantry, Canadian militia, and their allies. And then you've got mainly Pennsylvania, some New York militia, and their allied warriors. This is what makes this battle rather unique, that not only did the British have native allies, but the Americans have about 400 Seneca and Tuscarora allies working with them. The thing that Scott has on his side is he had some training as an artillery officer. So instead of the cannons taking pot shots at each other along the river road, he orders his gunners, and you can see the little cannon shooting like a shotgun there, turns their attention to the British infantry. And as the British infantry advance, they actually screen their own guns. So their artillery isn't of much use to the redcoats. Travis, you go to the next slide. And the other thing that Scott does is he brings another battery into action further in the plain, and they both start raking the front of the Royal Scots, and the 100th are getting decimated. And at this point in the war, the U.S. infantry, I'd say, is an even match for the British for their volume of fire. There's an argument that they were more accurate shooters. That isn't really the case necessarily. And in a battle like this, it was speed that mattered, and the Americans are able to match the British. And you can see with your guns screened and your line getting raked by American canister fire and pretty disciplined volleys from the U.S. infantry, Ryle decides he needs to retreat, and he heads back to Chippawa, where there is a fort, Chippawa, and they destroy the bridge over the Chippewa Creek, which is really where he should have stayed all along. Coming out to maybe help the guys out at Fort Erie was very honorable of him, but if he just stayed behind the creek with the defenses of Fort Chippewa, General Brown of the U.S. Army couldn't really have done much. And then you see there's a big left hook going on. Brown tries to bag the whole British force by sending Ripley's brigade and even some of Porter's men. Those are the militia and native allies around, but they never really get into action in this particular fight. But there'll be lots more fighting for them in the weeks to come. Next slide, please. So this looks like a repeat of an earlier slide. It is, because of course, this is just the opening fight in the campaign in Niagara of 1814. And the US Army makes it all the way down to Fort George. At this point, the British hold Fort Niagara on the US side. They captured it in December of the previous year. They hold Fort George. They're building a place called Fort Mississauga that you can visit today in the lovely town of Niagara Lake, Ontario. But the US Navy doesn't show up, and more British and Canadian troops start coming from the west. You see that big red arrow coming in from the west, and they decided to withdraw. And they have a vicious fight at Lundy's Lane. It's a night battle, about 1,800, 1,900 men killed or wounded there. This is after almost 800 men are killed or wounded at the Battle of Chippawa. So again, when both sides only have about 4,500 men deployed, between these two fights alone, you're looking at 2,700 casualties already. So after Lundy's Lane, Scott gets wounded, Brown gets wounded. That leaves Ripley as the American commander, and General Drummond comes in to take over from Ryle, and even Drummond gets wounded at the Battle of Lundy's Lane. The Americans withdraw. They pass by the battle site of Chippawa. They comment on the graves that have already been uncovered by the summer rains, and they retreat all the way back to Fort Erie, where the two forces slug it out for the better part of 2 months. You probably have close to another 3,000 casualties. You're almost running out of guys by the end, and both sides are bringing in more forces. Some veterans from Spain and the British Army start arriving, and an entire division of the US Army shows up. That Izzard guy, or Izzard, shows up, and they take one more swipe at the Niagara Peninsula, and it really ends at a battle called Cook's Mills that you can see there, when the Americans tried to flank the Chippewa position again. They beat up the British and the Canadians there quite well, just like they do at Chippewa and at Lundy's Lane and at Fort Erie. But in all of these engagements, the US Army performs well, but they take very heavy casualties, and they eventually withdraw back to Fort Erie on November the 5th, 1814. They blow up the fort at Fort Erie and go home. The treaty, of course, is signed in Belgium, the Treaty of Ghent, on Christmas Eve, 1814, a date not lost on the men signing the treaty. And of course, news of that treaty and its ratification take a couple of months. But that is the fighting in 1814, and hopefully explains how the Battle of Chippawa fits in as the opening engagement. I think that's it for the slide portion. This is where we're really going to get into sort of a question and answer thing amongst ourselves between Travis and I. And what I've always been impressed is the scale of what people are experiencing at events. It affects different groups of people differently. It can be debated and discussed about who has the most to lose. But I think it's safe to say that the Indigenous people of North America in any of these wars fought sort of from the French and Indian War, the American Revolution, the War of 1812, they have the most to lose. Their communities, their societies. And for a lot of these American and British generals who I've mentioned, this is really a career thing. Their families are safely in Virginia or in the north of England. So there's no way their families are going to be directly affected. So this is a lot to do with career development. They're making decisions based on career development. But for the average warrior, Travis, we could start off with the individual. What were these guys carrying? I think we have the image of the British red coat, and of course at Chippewa, the gray jacket, the famous gray jacket of Winfield Scott's brigade lives on at West Point. But we leave out the native warriors. So just like Graves's book, Red Coats and Gray Jackets, we left out an important, essential part of the guys on this battlefield. What were they carrying or wearing in this fight?
I'm just going to continue sharing my screen because I think the image of this warrior kind of self-explains that what Haudenosaunee and typical warriors might have looked like during the War of 1812. So you have to excuse me, and I'll use this image as basically what warriors would have been looking like. We often think of what we have this image in our head, I guess Hollywood image of what Native warriors would have looked like 200 years ago, or Native people in general. But at this point in history, they're being very influenced by European material. So in this particular image, you'll see, cloth shirts, wool leggings, cloth or wool breechcloth, as well as sashes that was wrapped around the waist. So pretty heavily influenced by European material, and they would often put a spin on it to personalize their look. Now, typically, they often would completely strip their body down, more or less, right down to being bare-chested, and often painted themselves, and they adorn themselves with a bunch of nasty implements. So you'll see a powder horn around the neck, often a knife, and then a cartridge box around the waist. And in this particular image, I am carrying a British version of the flintlock brown bess musket, which was issued to the warriors. Prior to the War of 1812 breaking out, they often probably would have had their own personal weapons that they would use and feel comfortable with, and often brought those out onto a battlefield. You can't really see it around the waist, but they often had a knife as well, and even tied around the knees, where these leg ties would be. Now, and I do have an example of other nasty implements that they would have carried into battle. They would often carry throwing hawks. Now you can see the size of this one. They often were very small. And here's a little bit of a longer one. This was also personalized items that they would often throw into their sash around their waist, or they would be readily available within arm's reach. These ones were often very popular because of the length. This one in particular, I believe, is just over a foot. One of the smaller ones that you would see out, but you can often throw this. It's a one-time use type weapon, as you can imagine.
Sorry, Travis, can I interrupt for a sec?
Yes.
Do you mind stop sharing so that we can get a bigger image of those things?
Better? Okay. Did my screen stop sharing?
It did, yes. There's just a little delay on the YouTube channel, so it'll catch up. Don't worry.
Okay. If I go into a big screen, I imagine this is a pretty standard throwing tomahawk that you would see. And as I mentioned before, this one's slightly longer, so you can see the differences. Pretty popular items that warriors would often use. As I mentioned, if you do throw them, they're often one-time uses. There are period accounts even stating that the Native warriors that did use these items out on the battlefield would throw with such great force to the distance of 20 to 30 paces away, and it would basically break skin. So very good to have the Native allies on your team. Prior to the war breaking out, they did have several councils to actually decide on what they're going to do, but I'll talk a little bit about that later. In terms of what they would often bring out to a battlefield, so those are items that each warrior would bring out. There was no standardized military, I guess, uniform that they often employed out onto a battlefield. It was more or less whatever they felt comfortable bringing. In terms of weaponry, on the British side, that's often what they would carry is the flintlock musket. For those who've never seen one, I'm sure this audience probably has. I do have an example of one. If I don't poke a hole into my ceiling of my office, I'll give you a closer look at what the primitive technology of the time period. Very high tech. The U.S. has a very similar type weapon, but that flintlock mechanism was top of the line in terms of technology of the time period. So no army had an advantage and no warrior had an advantage over anybody else. They're all combating the same issues with these flintlock weapons. In terms of the Battle of Chippawa, because it was Haudenosaunee fighting Haudenosaunee, the ones on the American side, so the US Native allies, were actually told to put on a white cloth almost around their head to identify them as US allies, Native allies, so that friendly fire or friendly casualties wouldn't happen out on the battlefield, which kind of contradicts being camouflage. So putting on a big white flag around your head often probably would have saved your life, you would think, out on a battlefield, because it would distinguish you on one side of the field opposed to the other. So that's basically what Haudenosaunee warriors and even Native warriors would have typically worn out on a battlefield, and in particular at Chippawa, as well as throughout the War of 1812. So a long-winded answer.
Now, where were all of these guys from? We've thrown out the names of some nations, but the Battle of Chippawa has been coming from a number of Indigenous nations and some leaders that might be recognizable to some of the people joining us this afternoon.
Yes. So there was part of, I'm sure some people that are watching might have heard the name Tecumseh. Some of his Western Confederacy participated in the battle. And Tecumseh, by this point in the War of 1812, had lost his life. So it was his brother that kind of took over the leadership of that Western Confederacy, a gentleman by the name of the Prophet, kind of led warriors out onto the field. Now, he gets recognized or mentioned in another gentleman that participated at the Battle of Chippawa on the British side by the name of John Norton. John Norton writes a journal about the Indigenous experience during the Battle of Chippawa. And he does mention that the Prophet was there after the battle. So we're not entirely sure on whether or not the Prophet actually engaged in the Battle of Chippawa. But we do know there was another Seneca leader on the US side that did actually cross the river with the US Army. And his name was Red Jacket. Now, he was a very dominant leader in the Seneca Nation on the US side. Now, the Seneca Nation is a part of the Haudenosaunee. For those that don't know, the Haudenosaunee is made up of 6 separate nations or tribes that make up the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, 3 of which resided on the US side. Those were the ones that joined up and fight with the US Army for the last year of the war, which was 1814. So those 3 nations or tribes were the Senecas, Onondagas, and the Tuscaroras. Now, those 3 nations tried to remain neutral throughout the entire war. But in the winter of 1813, the British Army crossed the Niagara River, and the entire length of the Niagara River, which was approximately 60 kilometers, they burnt every village down from Lewiston, New York, which is the north end, all the way down to Buffalo, New York, which is the southern point of the Niagara River. And in the midst of that, they unfortunately torched 2 Haudenosaunee villages. So in retaliation or revenge for their villages being burnt down, the US Army used that as encouragement to get the Haudenosaunee on the US side to join up and fight with them. So in revenge of their villages being burnt down, that was partially the reason why they join up and fight with the US Army. But predominantly throughout the entire war itself, the Haudenosaunee on the British side participated in on the British side throughout the entire War of 1812. So we roughly state or say 90 to 95% chose the British to fight alongside. The ones on the US side tried to remain neutral throughout the entire war. And at this particular battle, that's where they were more or less pitted against each other. So on the US side, their native allies or their native leaders was Red Jacket, potentially the Prophet as well. On the British side, John Norton, as well as another gentleman by the name of John Brant. John Brant is the son of the famous Joseph Brant. And at this point in the War of 1812, I think he's just turning the ripe old age of 20 years old by 1814. Very, very young leader. And up against basically John Norton, who was, I believe, in his mid-40s. And as for Red Jacket on the US side, he was well into his 60s. So it's hard pressed to believe that Red Jacket engaged in the battle. He probably took more of a leadership role on the on the back of the line. So he probably wasn't engaged in any of the fighting that took place during the Battle of Chippawa. But that's pretty much the key figures and players that you had out on the battlefield. Now, a lot of those names that I mentioned, if not all of them, are pretty heavy hitters in the Haudenosaunee Confederacy.
You also have some Anishinaabe men as well, who would be from what we now consider Ontario, and the remains of Tecumseh. So there's sort of three groups here. There's the Haudenosaunee, which were traditionally from what's now upstate New York. There's the Anishinaabe that cover a really big geographic area, sort of from Montreal all the way west out to Manitoba, and they're bordered on the north by the Cree. And then the south of the Great Lakes is really Tecumseh's Confederacy, but there's a little crossover, right? There's Potawatomis and Odawas and Ojibwe who join, and some Haudenosaunee who join up with Tecumseh for a while, right? So there is some crossover of men who are often young men off to prove themselves. So they head off to fight, even though their own councils are neutral or trying to stay out of it. Can you talk a bit about that motivation, either for the individual or the community?
Other than, the motivation of unfortunately having your village burnt down on the US side, some of the motivation for some of these young warriors, often leadership. Norton was seemed to be pretty persuasive, as well as John Brant, the notoriety that he had following his father's footsteps. Often was enough to get some of these young warriors to participate in particular battles. The Anishinaabe, there was the Delaware, Lenape, that also participated. Now, these aren't typically Haudenosaunee nations, but these other allied nations did participate in the Battle of Chippawa along with the Anishinaabe. Their motivation, at this point in the war, they had gone on 2.5 years of fighting. And this was the first engagement where they were actually pitted against each other. So after the battle, and I'll probably touch on it a little bit later in our discussion, but Norton and John Brant had a contingent of about 400 to 500, or a few hundred, on the British side participating in the Battle of Chippawa. Now, that's not to say that all of them engaged at once. They kind of came in waves, as well as the U.S. Native allies. There was approximately 400 to 500 that crossed the river. Now, that wasn't, and much like the British side, not all of them were engaged all at once. They did come in waves and engaging each other. I think the motivation for a lot of the Haudenosaunee was the leadership that encouraged them. Now, prior to the War of 1812 breaking out, and even the Battle of Chippawa, even the Niagara 1814 campaign, there was multiple councils amongst the Haudenosaunee on the U.S. side and the British side, trying to determine exactly who was going to do what. The ones on the British side were pretty upfront and stern with their decision on fighting alongside the British, and it was much to the chagrin of the U.S. Native allies, because they wanted everybody to remain neutral. They weren't very fond of the British based off of their relationship after the American Revolution, where a lot of the Haudenosaunee were kicked out of the Western New York or upstate New York. Those who were allied with the British went with the British to cross the Niagara River and start a new life. There was some on the U.S. side that were Native allies during the American Revolution that were able to stay in New York State. So when the War of 1812 rolls around, you had ones on the U.S. side that were more pro-American, but not by much. But there was ones on the British side that were pro-British. So multiple councils. There was two in particular. There was one in 1808 and one in 1810. Now, these were held either in Grand River or actually at the mouth of Detroit River in a place called Brownstown. They got together, and this is where a lot of back and forth and debating actually took place. There was a gentleman in the U.S. Army by the name of William Hull. He actually was in attendance for one of these meetings in Detroit, and he basically states that Red Jacket strongly encouraged the British Native allies to stay out of the war. Now, in Hull's kind of synopsis of what he witnesses during this council taking place, He doesn't really state any of the other Native leadership other than British allied nations that attended this council. So I'm not entirely sure who on the British side was at this council, but it basically does. Hall does state that Red Jacket was pretty much the speaker at these councils. So with all these two particular councils having to take place prior to the war, it still really didn't change much when the War of 1812 breaks out. So the U.S. ones did try to remain neutral throughout the entire war, but predominantly the ones on the British side did participate and engage throughout the entire war itself. So hopefully that answers the question as to some of the motivations that they had. The longstanding relationship that the British allied nations had with the British Army seemed to make sense. There was treaties that was signed and agreements that was made between British and the Haudenosaunee on the British side to keep that relationship going. It seemed to be that there was a little bit better of a friendship there than the U.S. Native allies had with the American government. So that partnership basically carried over into this war. And yeah, and it was basically those two gentlemen, John Norton and John Brandt, that led most of the warriors on the British side.
So what would this fight? You mentioned the equipment and clothing they had. What would the fight in the woods been like for these warriors, or even the militiamen and other soldiers who are around them, compared to the big fight going on the plain?
Yeah, and even that your one slide, if everyone can imagine that little offshoot, the map that showed the Native allies and the U.S. Native allies off to the left in the trees. Norton often writes that this, and to me, kind of seems like a dogfight. And it was hand-to-hand combat once they basically got engaged. And it seemed to me that they kind of stumbled upon each other with the smoke that actually was created from these black powder weapons. Norton writes about how nobody could really see what each other was doing other than what was in their presence. So it kind of explains to us that basically everything within arm's reach was the only thing that people saw. So friendly fire and friendly casualties potentially might have actually happened. And Norton does write about that. And one even Native warrior on the U.S. side was terrified because he said a British soldier or British militiaman that was in the woods thought he was an allied nation, where he was actually on the U.S. side, the opposite side. And he was fearful of his life that this British soldier or a militiaman was going to kill him. So much like how I mentioned before, the Native allies didn't have a uniform, so it was hard to tell who was who, especially in ambush style warfare. And the militiamen had to endure basically almost the same thing because they weren't issued a military uniform as well. They just basically wore whatever was in their dresser that morning. So if you can imagine this, it's like playing a sports game with no uniforms. So it's really hard to tell who's on your team. And this seems to be prevalent during this particular part of the Battle of Chippawa. So the hand-to-hand combat, there were warriors that were killed, and there were warriors that engaged one another. And that's what makes this particular battle very unfortunate and very unique, was that you had Haudenosaunee killing Haudenosaunee. And these people all fall under one umbrella, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. And it was unfortunate, but it did cause a little bit of a ripple effect after this particular battle, to the point that it called for basically these two leaders to kind of sit down and rethink about their involvement in this particular war. So that portion of the battle really highlights what it did to the Haudenosaunee people, and not only the Haudenosaunee, but Native allies on both sides as a whole, and kind of to rethink what their next steps will be, if this is how it's going to be played out, if they're going to be pitted against each other. So this kind of was a culmination and a pinnacle point in their involvement in the War of 1812 that came out of this battle during the Battle of Chippawa.
And so we've got a couple hundred Native men on both sides here. What happens to them after this battle? This is sort of a two-part question. There's the short term, what happens during the rest of the campaign and the war. And then there's the longer term question, what happens to these men and their nations and their communities in the aftermath of the War of 1812?
Yeah, so I'll go to your short term. What happened after the Battle of Chippawa, and as I just recently just mentioned, that they had to rethink kind of their involvement in this war. So there was a council that happened, and it was almost like a private council, the way Norton writes about it, that it wasn't almost called for. It kind of just happened. There were a couple prisoners of war that were Native or U.S. Native allies that were captured, and were brought to Burlington. And when Norton gets to Burlington, he sees these two prisoners of war, and he recognizes one of them. And it was more or less the conversation that they had amongst each other, that they kind of decided to more or less stay out of the war. Now, Norton was a huge advocate. Well, not a huge, but he was a pretty big advocate of the King and the British Army. So he kind of knew he was going to participate for the remainder of the war. But what was discussed, it sounds like the U.S. ones were just basically going to go home. And some of the ones on under Norton's leadership were going to do the same, because it was basically heart-wrenching and heartbreaking to basically for these warriors to be killing off each other. In the heat of battle, it was more or less survival. But once you sit down after this battle, I think it really hit home with a lot of these warriors that it's not worth it anymore. 2.5 years of fighting, they kind of just they've had enough, and they think they did their duty for the British Army up until this point. So a lot of them did decide to basically go back to their community and sit out the remainder of the war. So that was the short-term reaction, I guess, after the Battle of Chippawa. In terms of the long term, the remainder of the year 1814, you mentioned that the siege of Fort Erie was basically the end of the 1814 campaign. Now, at that particular siege, there wasn't many Native warriors in that were participating. And even the U.S. Native allies, they also really didn't have a lot of participation at the siege of Fort Erie. Now, there was a presence, but in terms of engagement during the siege of Fort Erie, it was pretty minimal. They were used in the night assault during the siege of Fort Erie, but it wasn't to the, I guess, the high level standard that they typically would be used for out on a battlefield. So you see this fizzle out towards the tail end of the 1814 campaign. Now, that basically ends, they didn't know the war was going to end, but they did see it coming to an end after the Battle of Chippawa. So as you mentioned, the peace treaty was signed in December of 1814. So the war really didn't continue much further past the Battle of Chippawa. And personally, it was when the peace treaty was signed, there was no Indigenous voice sitting at the table advocating for what was promised to their allies prior to the war. They were basically promised more land if they helped out with the British on the British side. Now, I personally think that this was attributed to kind of two links in the chain that were Indigenous advocates, if not Indigenous, well, they were, that lost their lives during the War of 1812. So one of those was Tecumseh and Sir Isaac Brock. Now, Isaac Brock was pretty much a very big link in the chain to the king. So if he had survived the war, I think it might have been a little bit different outcome for what was promised to the Indigenous allies. And even if Tecumseh survived the war, potentially things might have been a little bit different than how they played out. So yeah, when negotiations were being discussed, there was no voice sitting at the table stating, hey, this is kind of what we've also promised to our Indigenous allies for their participation. So very unfortunate, and that happened. But going back to like the tail end of 1814, there was basically, their community was threatened, the Grand River community on the British side, by a U.S. Officer by the name of MacArthur. MacArthur actually launched a raid from Detroit, and he kind of did a big circle throughout Upper Canada and kind of turned around and came back. And basically his whole goal was to, kind of destroy the supply lines of the British Army and the Indigenous allies. So burning mills, burning farms, as well as basically causing a path of destruction throughout his entire raid and march. Was semi-successful in doing so, but that was also another reason why the Indigenous allies wanted to go home, was to protect their families and protect their communities, because they thought that the U.S. Army was, because they made it that far to the siege of Fort Erie, that it may have been a matter of time before they reached the Six Nations or the Grand River community, which wasn't very far from where the Americans captured Fort Erie. So that threat also was another reason why they kind of just wanted to go home for the remainder of the war, to wait to see if the U.S. are actually going to leave. So.
And that it sort of oversimplifies the geography, but the Grand River, which flows into Lake Erie, is sort of the halfway point, not really halfway, I guess sort of halfway between the Niagara River and the Detroit River, right?
Yes.
So you've got this much bigger American force on the Niagara River, but a mounted, faster moving raiding party under MacArthur that make it to the Grand River. Like they make it all the way there. But don't really go past the Grand River. I think if they'd gone past the Grand River, they would have then had that community threatening their supply lines, right? So
yes,
but clearly the warriors have more immediate concerns back at home than fighting along the Niagara River. Of course, on both sides, I mean, promises were made. One of the American brigade commanders, Porter, he suggested right off the bat, I mean, he lives in Black Rock, which is still a neighborhood of Buffalo, New York. He could see Canada from his front door. We burned his house down during the War of 1812. During that period you mentioned, where we burned everything on the New York side, including Peter Porter's home. But he was a pretty important politician. I think he was in the whatever their foreign relations committee in Congress was at the time, and he's the guy early on who said, "Okay, we'll have a war." He was a war hawk for a Northerner who wanted to go to war. Rather unique to a certain extent, but he said, right, we got to build a fleet on the Great Lakes, we got to train a regular army, and we need native allies. And everybody laughed at him. This is Canada. It's just, we'll get some militia guys together. We'll roll in there. We certainly don't want to arm native people. And he was even keen on recruiting Canadians. And ultimately he has this group of Canadian volunteers in his brigade. So he's making promises. The British had made promises that they just weren't going to keep. There's an article of the 11 in the treaty that talk about all the lands go back. So any lands that have been taken go back. And I think it could be argued both sides don't live up to their commitment to the Indigenous people involved there. And then you just see, and we've talked about this many times, Travis, in the period following the War of 1812, this influx of people from Europe were digging canals, and steamships arrive, and just hordes of Europeans are arriving. And a lot of these treaties and alliances and battles are often forgotten by people who should have known better, who were there, who experienced this, who saw the sacrifice of these men in their communities, and really leave them out of any discussion or negotiations going forward. And that's really this bond that was broken, I think, in the decades following this conflict, that we weren't really living up to what we were supposed to do during the fighting, and then after the war it just gets worse for these communities.
Yeah, the further it seems it got away from 1814, the renewed friendship you often hear, or polishing the chain. These terms were often used to explain the relationship that the Indigenous allies had with the British Army and the British Crown. So they often state, some Indigenous leaders, even to this day, that friendship got kind of rusty. So these discussions that are coming out in modern times, and even to this day, like, you often hear Indigenous leaders talk about, polishing this covenant chain to renew this friendship. And it seems like it kind of, this tails back to the end of the War of 1812. And it kind of started with, not having any advocates sitting at that table. So prior to the war, all these belts and these agreements and treaties were often being talked about at these councils to remind the British that this is our previous agreement, not even with you in particular, but the British, almost the institution of the British King and the British Crown. So these are often brought out at councils to remind some of the British leadership that this is what was promised. So you're starting to see that full circle come back around even to this day, of these agreements kind of being rediscussed and renewed. So it can be attributed back to, this war.
Well, there you go. By participating this afternoon, people are helping polish the covenant chain, right? By learning and just talking about this. So now we got to give time for questions here. So we've taken up a chunk of their time here, and we'll see if Tom and Chris have questions.
Thank you so much to both of you. Jim, I have to say, you've managed to anticipate several of my questions. So thank you very much for that. Just to our audience online, just a quick, and actually to both of you as well, just a quick reminder, there is a delay between what we're seeing on Zoom and what happens on YouTube. So sometimes people will post a question and, we won't see it for, a couple minutes or whatever. So I apologize for that if that does happen. We'll try to keep up as best we can. I was noting down some questions as people were asking them throughout the talk, so I'll try to get to as many of those as I can as well. Travis, you were talking about sort of the effects of the battle in 1814 and then afterwards. I wonder if you could go a little bit further though, the lasting effects. Are those effects were those effects of the battle felt in sort of the 1820s? How did these, you've got these six nations, how did they really repair that relationship with each other after 1850, after 1815, when, they've stopped fighting? What were the effects of that sort of even going further?
And it's a very great question. I didn't really highlight kind of what it did to the Confederacy. I did lightly say that it caused a ripple amongst the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, but it did kind of not so much drive a wedge through the Confederacy, but it further separated the leadership as separated the leadership because the ones on the U.S. side, they basically kind of said, "I told you so." That this is kind of the treatment that they were going to get because they've experienced that prior to the War of 1812 breaking out. The ones on the U.S. side weren't very big advocates of the British Army. The ones on the British side sliding into like the 1820s and the 1830s, these communities still hadn't, were still a little upset that not everything was being given back to them or that was promised to them. Was basically kind of like it stalled out those discussions, and nobody was really listening to any of the Indigenous leadership when these issues were brought up, more in particular some of the land that was promised to them prior to the war breaking out. So it kind of further separated not only the leadership within the Confederacy, but it further separated the relationship with the British King and the British Crown post-war. So kind of unfortunate, but afterwards, I think in the 1820s, 1830s, you started to see this leadership get aging out and getting a little old. And some of the younger leadership actually kind of reformed this bond within the Confederacy to repair these communities and the relationship even within the Confederacy. They often were very, very strong in terms of negotiations, even with whether it's the British or the US. As a whole entire Confederacy, if you break them down into separate different nations, that voice wasn't as strong as when it was when they were all together. So they start to realize this post-war. So as time continues on after the War of 1812, they slowly start to repair that. But even that in itself took time to regain that voice that they had prior to the war.
Yeah, that's absolutely fair. I mean, it was like you said several times, right? It was a devastating battle on both sides. So you've touched on this a little bit, certainly in terms of land promises that are, 200 years later are still falling short. Was there any, did the British Army compensate the warriors in any way for fighting on their behalf?
Yeah, they were promised, military issued supplies, whatever was more or less kind of given to the private soldiers. They did have access to as well. And they were supposed to be paid. But we often state that, in terms of the payroll, they were put at the bottom. So everybody else kind of got paid prior to the Native warriors, and delayed payments. And even like years after the war, some of them were still asking the British Crown for, compensation for what they did, and even losses, whether it was, to their community or to their farms, they were still looking for compensation afterwards. Now, this not only was unfortunate for the Indigenous people, but even the citizens as well took multiple years for them to actually get compensation for property being destroyed. But yeah, they were paid, as well as equipped, just like regular soldiers were, as well as they were supplied with ammunition. And they were heavily encouraged. In one account, I believe, I forget where I read this, but they state that the warriors were paid more than private soldiers just to show up to a battle. The biggest advantage is, like, there was no commitment. You're not signing a contract stating you're with us for 7 years. They can come and go as if at their leisure. So that was, I know, a bit frustrating for some of the British leadership, because they had no idea who was going to show up and the amount of warriors that were going to show up. Even though they thought, like, well, we're paying these people more than private soldiers, why aren't they here? But they often didn't think of, what it does to a community when you see young men leaving your community that you may not know are going to come back or not. So,
and like the militia on both sides, crops had to be planted and harvests had to be brought in, or everybody was going to go hungry. So you did have to have that flexibility. And for the Grand River people, the Grand River tract used to go for a couple 100 miles north from Lake Erie. And it's really in the decades that follow that those parcels of land are chopped up and given away. And we talk about the British, but the government of Upper Canada had a lot to do with how land was distributed to new arrivals. So they were as guilty as the British Crown way off in London for the lands that are really being taken away by allies who had fought honorably. And to look at, things changed on the American side. The relationship did change with some Indigenous people, but in general, all the areas of the lower part of Michigan, ironically enough, Indiana, all of Ohio was basically completely ethnically cleansed of Indigenous people by the American military and American settlers following the war. So even if people had been allies and friends, on both sides, we hadn't treated them particularly well. But there's a certain honesty about the Americans that there was more of them than there were Canadians, and they were land hungry, and they were taking more of it at a faster rate than Canadians were. Where Canadians could say, well, these are our friends and allies. Well, we weren't treating our friends and allies particularly well. Young John Brant would go on to be the first Indigenous person elected to the legislature, but he never did sit in York. I guess it was a cholera epidemic went through, and he lost his life when he was maybe in his early 30s. Travis,
Yeah, I think he was 34.
So yeah, you're losing not only did the war take away a generation from these communities, but the diseases that followed also took away people.
I just shared my screen of the map of that we're discussing and talking about for our viewers that aren't really familiar with Niagara region, or what we're kind of, I guess, throwing out there as if you do know. So this little river here is the Grand River. So when we often say they came from the Grand River tract, this community that's called Oswego, it was the Grand River community 200 years ago. And even to this day, it's currently a reservation. So after the American Revolution, the British Army granted the Native allies 6 miles on either side of this Grand River. And this community is what's left of that original tract. So if you follow this Grand River, it kind of snakes through
It
Brantford.
goes a lot further north. Yeah.
Yeah, and often, yeah. So give you an idea of the size of the Grand River, it kind of snakes all the way through the province of Ontario. And that was what was supposed to be given to them. This is after the American Revolution, so this isn't related to the War of 1812, but that was supposed to be their community. So when the War of 1812 breaks out, this is the area that they're coming from. So you can see how close it is in the map that we talked about during the Battle of Chippawa. This is the Niagara River. To put things into context, this was Fort Erie, and Chippawa is like halfway between Fort Erie and Niagara Falls, maybe closer to Niagara Falls. So that would have been in this
Right
area.
there. Yep.
Is where the Battle of Chippawa. So if you can look at geographically, you see the Americans basically stating here, and more or less the community is rather within arm's reach 200 years ago of being threatened by the American army. So after the Battle of Chippawa, a lot of them chose just to go home to protect their community. And I mentioned Duncan MacArthur's raid. He kind of comes from the western side over here,
Right.
and then does kind of a big, huge circle, and then turns around and goes home. So I hope
So
that
Chris,
puts things into context.
And Chris, you're in London, so you're not on the Haldimand track, but I think Mr. Fournier is actually on the Haldimand track.
That's right. Yep. So Travis, sort of zooming in on those relationships, right? We've talked a lot about the relationship between the Indigenous communities and the Crown or the U.S. What about the relationship between sort of the Indigenous people and the local Upper Canadian settlers? Was there generally a positive relationship between the two? Was it were they did they ignore each other? What was the relationship like between those Upper Canadian communities and the Indigenous people?
So if kind of there's two answers here. If you look at the Indigenous leadership and some of the leadership, even in or upstanding citizens in adjacent communities, there was a relationship there. But if you talk more of like on a citizen level, it's hard to state whether or not like there was a friendship or relationship. But even Norton often writes in his journal prior to the war breaking out of like visiting friends in Grimsby and adjacent communities and having dinner with them. Now, I'm not entirely sure if that would have actually translated down to, a common citizen warrior that was, a teenager. If he left the community, what kind of treatment he would get. But I think at this point in Ontario's history, they had been neighbors for probably 20, 30 years now. So at that point, you would have to assume that, a friendship might have actually developed over that time with adjacent communities and farmers outside of the Six Nations community. They were well aware that, it wasn't Farmer Joe that took the land. It was, the British Crown or leadership that was over here in Upper Canada that was taking advantage of the land that was supposed to be given to the Indigenous allies. So that's not to state that all relationships are like that. You often found some people leaving the Indigenous community that, had a chip on their shoulder. And it's the same with, non-Indigenous communities that were outside of the Grand River tract that they weren't all good apples. But in terms of the leadership from the communities, it seemed that there was a friendship there prior to the war breaking out.
Thank you. So just time for a couple more questions, but I'm wondering if we can turn a little bit to sort of the history of these battles, sort of the more modern. So the one is, I'm wondering, obviously on both sides of the Battle of Chippawa, casualties in the Haudenosaunee people. Are there any? Is there any still knowledge of who those men were? Are there names? Not necessarily recorded, but sort of passed down. Is that knowledge still around?
So it's a very good question. Coincidentally, Jim mentioned a book that mentions a casualty list of names that lost their lives at the Battle of Chippawa, and I had it within arm's reach. So I'm not entirely sure if that's coming through on people's screens, but Jim mentioned Red Coat and Gray Jackets by Donald Graves. In this book, he actually identifies the warriors that did lose their life. But it's not an accurate count that anybody believes of the amount of warriors that did lose their lives. In his in the back of it, in the appendix, there's 16 warriors that are identified and named on the British side, as well as their nation or their tribe. Predominantly, a lot of the casualties were all Chippewa, so not even Haudenosaunee. So it kind of goes to show you what it had done to the Chippewa community by losing this many warriors in a battle. So when you come home from a battle and you're missing half of the people that walked out of the village, the devastating effect that it had on the community and the family, they had to live with it. So a lot of them were upset, and even Norton writes about some of the disgruntledness of these warriors losing their life. But to answer your question, yeah, there were 16 of them that were identified in Don Graves's book on the British side, and I think he identified three Seneca warriors on the American side. And he, believe it or not, they actually had their indigenous name. It wasn't their anglicized or Christian name that was given to them. So these are identified in Don Graves's book.
No, I think the American list is maybe not complete. So just as Travis said, the British list isn't complete, but I think there's probably far more Senecas and maybe some Tuscaroras who lose their lives as well. There were supposed to be able to, just like a British soldier, there was supposed to be something to support the widows and orphans. And eventually, if these guys lived long enough, they got a medal, just like the soldiers did. Although, Chris, you probably know when the service medal was better than we would. It was eventually given up. But I think the guy with the most clasps for the War of 1812 was a Haudenosaunee warrior, but from the Seven Nations up on the St. Lawrence. So somehow he was at Chateauguay, but he also ended up in Upper Canada fighting. So the most highly decorated fellow on the British side in the War of 1812 was actually a warrior. Of course, I don't have his name handy, but I'll have to follow up on that.
And one final question, Jim, maybe I haven't tapped your incredible knowledge very much, but has there been archaeological work done on the battlefield at Chippawa?
Yeah, pretty limited. Probably the last time we took a crack at it was about 20 years ago. And as I mentioned, when the U.S. Army withdrew after the Battle of Lundy's Lane, they talked about seeing the graves of the men sort of laid bare. This is, and I think you can relate to this, Chris, and maybe some of the people listening who participated in the reenactment in 2014. The land there is referred to as Willoughby clay. It's like rock. How anybody farmed it is before mechanization is sort of unbelievable. So these American kids, a lot of them come from farm backgrounds. One of them does comment about how tough it was to dig into the soil to try to at least bury their friends who died mainly in that line of Scott's brigade. But they did try to bury the British dead as well. But literally a couple of weeks later, on their way back to Fort Erie, they passed by the battlefield and their efforts had failed. These men are just laid out. So between, animals scavenging, intense heat and rain through the rest of the summer, and then what you have is mechanized farming in the 19th and 20th century. And anything that would be deemed a grave is pretty much chewed up. What happens to native warriors who are killed? A lot of them are taken off the field. The indigenous warriors were very keen on removing their dead if they could. In this case, if for the British, if they lost men, you probably weren't going to be able to recover them because the Americans held the field. So not a lot there. I mean, we found some grape shot, and that's mainly the kind of ammunition the artillery was using on that day. They weren't going to be firing a lot of solid shot or shrapnel shells. It's just it's a closer range fight, and they're firing a canister around. So other than that, and a few buttons, like sort of that standard scrolled eye American button for the infantry, there just aren't a lot of things that were found.
Interesting. Well, I'm going to have to talk on behalf of Tom. Tom unfortunately had I think he said a power surge in his office, and so he is still watching. but he just can't get Zoom back up. It's frozen. But on behalf of Tom and myself, I just want to say thank you so much to both of you. Your Travis, your knowledge of sort of the wider relationships and everything is just overwhelming. And Jim, you you seem to know exactly what to ask to bring out all the pertinent details. Like I say, you were constantly anticipating my questions. So I have to say, if anybody in our audience is anywhere in southwestern Ontario and you've not visited Fort Erie, it's a fantastic site, and you can go and see these two wonderful people and how much knowledge they have to share, and how much they love sharing their knowledge with people. And also on that note, they're both working very hard. I know, although Jim, not quite so hard the last 2 weeks, but they are both working very hard on the commemoration of the Battle of Queenston Heights, which of course was another very important battle for the Indigenous people in Upper Canada. So if you are able on the 15th of October, we'd love to see you out to support that event as well. But thank you both so much for joining us today, sharing all your knowledge. I hope you enjoyed it. But to our audience, thank you so much for participating. As I think Jim and Travis both said, this is sort of one small step. The education is hugely important for recognizing just everything that the Indigenous people have done for us in Ontario. So this is one small step. So thank you so much for joining us.